Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's video podcast. Today, it's a really great pleasure to be joined by Brooke Islam Roberts, and she's both a journalist for Forbes and Business of Fashion, and also the founder of Textile, which is where we met some years ago. I did work it out; it was 2018. It's a long time ago. It's when we founded Texintel, actually. We also have with us, thank you so much for joining us, Anja Sadock, who is the Senior VP of Marketing over at Trustrace. And we all met together at the Global Fashion Summit just a few weeks ago, although it feels like a long time ago now.
It does, right?
Yeah, it does. It does. So I'd really like to talk today about the critical topic, the elephant in the room, regulation, compliance, and the huge opportunity that actually gives to the fashion supply chain. There's quite often a lot of pushback. And today what I really want to do is explore the various nuances of everything that has to happen here and why it's so important and why it's a real, it's an incredibly positive step. And wherever we are within the supply chain, whichever seat we sit in, we all have to make the effort and move forward with this as quickly as possible, really, most definitely. So we're short of time today, so let's dive straight in. Anja, do you want to give us just a little intro into Trustrace, please?
Yeah, sure. So we are basically a supply chain traceability platform. So we help companies gather data, primary data on what's actually happening in their supply chains, where they're producing, how they're producing, so they can get a full overview of basically their sourcing and use that data to discover and manage environmental and social risk. They can manage and prove compliance, and they can ultimately improve their impact, which is what we all want to see. So basically end-to-end supply chain data management to improve impact.
Okay.
We work with, so we're a global company. We are headquartered in Sweden. We work with many of the world's largest brands. It's representing about $200 billion in retail sales.
A significant figure.
It's up there.
It is up there, most definitely, yeah. Brooke, could you give us an intro to yourself, please, and your career so far and where you now reside and what you're up to?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a journalist. I primarily write for Forbes and Business of Fashion. That's in a freelance capacity. At Forbes, I cover supply chains and innovation. And at Business of Fashion, I cover global trade and the business dealings in supply chains. Parallel to that, as you mentioned, I'm the founder of Textile, which is a 10-year-old consultancy business that I've been running. And within Textile, I do other things like write books. I authored the Ganni Playbook alongside of Nikolai Refstrup, which was published last year by Penguin. It's the story of the Ganni brand and how it embedded responsibility into the business. But then I also consult for different companies and write reports. And one of those companies is Trustrace, who hired me to author the Trustrace Playbook this year, which contains the compliance canvas that we're going to be speaking about. So I come in as a sort of an independent writer and consultant and work with the team there, the brilliant team. This is the second year in a row we've authored the book together and try to put the playbook together and bring some objectivity, which is a beneficial sort of thing that I can bring to the table because I'm reporting for Forbes and Business of Fashion. And I try to apply the same sort of analysis that I would with my investigative journalism and make sure that the book is doing what it needs to do for the readership. It's really in service to the industry. And I'm sure Anja will sort of talk a little bit more about the whats and the whys and the hows because Trustrace drives it from internal.
Brooke, I've read a lot of your work, actually, and you are incredibly forensic. And I really, it's fantastic to see you doing that. No stone is unturned in your investigations.
Yes, I'm dogged, absolutely dogged. I have an eye for detail. I really am passionate about this work.
Yeah.
And before I went into fashion journalism, I owned a brand and I did production myself, design production. So I've worked in the supply chain and I take every facet seriously and I want to do justice to every stakeholder group.
Okay, great. Let's dive in then. Let's dive into the compliance canvas then. The imperative for fashion then, for both of you, really, regulatory compliance is a must-have, surely now for businesses. Could you both, maybe Anja, you going first? Why?
Why? I think compliance has always been a must-have, right? So that in itself is nothing new. I think what is new is the amount of regulations, the scope of regulations, the complexity of the regulations, and frankly, with the latest developments in both the US and the EU, the volatility of the regulations and how they change. So whereas compliance maybe earlier was you could focus on a couple of things like 2020, what we cover in this book, and when some of the brands that we worked with started, there were just a couple of regulations out there, and now we're covering 16, and there's way more, obviously, that brands and suppliers need to be aware of, but those are the ones that we're covering in the book. So just staying on top of those, what the requirements are, what that actually means, and trying to basically gather evidence for that is today already very tricky. We see that with the suppliers that we talk to, both through our work and also that have been interviewed for the playbook. It's 150 hours plus a month just gathering this data for them. And that's without all these regulations being enforced yet, right? Imagine when the DPP comes and whereas the omnibus and the ESPR and some things seem to be rolled back or are being rolled back or watered down, that's not the expectation of the DPP, for instance. That's will most likely become even more because it will carry not just DPP information, but for tariffs, for trades, for like all of the documentation you need around a product. And to gather that data, if it's already difficult now, it will become impossible if we don't set up a structure with it. For what we see is that there's a lack of standardization. One thing is understanding the laws, but how do you actually implement that? How do you actually gather data on that? Because also the way that currently a lot of information is gathered is through questionnaires, which is not really scalable. So it's like there's this overwhelm of there's too much going on, and maybe this will change next week with a new government or what the commission says. It's almost tempting to do nothing, and that's the worst thing you can do right now because you end up even more in the backseat. So given we work with very proactive brands that are trying to get in the ahead of this, basically, we wanted to share this knowledge because we've been analyzing the laws and regulations globally, but particularly focused on the US and EU, where most of the market access regulations are. And basically, okay, if we now have figured out at least how we see that you can gather data once and use it across all the different regulations, so you are compliant, you can get that sorted, and then you can actually start looking ahead and seeing, but how can this drive value for me? How can we drive impact with this? I think that's where we need to get to. But if it's too complex, even doing step one, you will never get to step 2 and 3. So we really just want to, and that's what all the playbooks are about, kind of share the knowledge that we have with the industry to help move everyone forward.
Yeah. Brooke, why do you think it's so tricky? Why is it the industry is just historically in silos?
There's lots of reasons why it's tricky, but I think one of the primary ones and one of the key ones to maybe focus in on for now is something Anja mentioned, which is to dig in a little deeper. From 2020 to 2024, the number of regulations that our industry is facing went from 3 to 16.
Wow.
So and the 3 had been focused on safety and quality regarding materials and products, things like flammability and chemical compliance. Now, not only do we have many more regulations, but they're of a different type. They require environmental data. They require social due diligence data. So it's the number of regulations, it's the type of data, it's the breadth as well, and the global nature of it. So that's the first thing to understand. And if I take a little step to the side and talk a bit about this playbook that we launched during the Global Fashion Summit and the compliance canvas within it, what was clear when I interviewed Adidas, Primark, and Hugo Boss for the playbook was that the processes they had internally for managing this data would not be scalable in the face of the 16 regulations and in the face of the complexity of the data needs. Okay. So it's not even so much of a why should we do it? Why is it important? It's a case of it's just not going to be manageable otherwise. Without some frameworks and some structures, we can't even make sense of what we're doing. We don't even have a system. So the sort of the ground level for preparing for all of this is having a system.
Yep.
And one of the pillars of that system is mapping your supply chain and knowing where everything comes from. And another is then evaluating all of the regulations, working out which ones you're in scope for, working out which ones are most critical to your particular business, and then defining the data points to collect and from whom. And in essence, that's what this playbook does on behalf of the industry. The powerful and important position that Trustrace has, and that I have as an author working with them, is to do this groundwork on behalf of everyone from an objective, independent point of view, and say, if we're looking at this from the outside in, what are all these regulations telling us? What are the commonalities? What can we deduce from the similar regulations that have come before them? For example, eco-design, ESPR, is not new. It's been in place for electronic goods for some time. There are things we know about it. It's just come in for textile products. We can use that now, that brain power and that analytical ability to help brands who are only independent. They are sort of the smallest unit. Help them get some sense of community around this and togetherness with that objective evaluation, and then work out how to get that structure in place and get going. So I think I rather think of it in that way rather than try and think of, all of the data or all of the sources of the data or all of the tiers in the supply chain, because what you'll also see and what the listeners will see is that this has been distilled into a compliance canvas that's free to download in spreadsheet form and represents 171 data points that are needed to comply on the most basic level with the 16 regulations as we know them today. So it's complicated, but it's manageable, I guess, is the headline.
But it can't be ignored, most definitely.
Well, I mean, it's good business.
Yeah.
It's not even that we need to make a case for this. It's just, I think any other industry kind of already knows this. What you understand about your business, you can manage. It's really as simple as that. Once a company like Adidas or Primark or Hugo Boss can track the flows of their materials through purchase orders, through traceability, they know where the volumes and types of production are. And then they know what the geopolitical or environmental or social risk associated with those places may be. This is just merely good business, smart business, dynamic business, agile business. And that's the only business of today.
It is. You people can't sit there and wonder why they're losing market share, because they're going to.
Or just sort of, and we had a really great discussion actually within the playbook too about how risk is evaluated, because it's highly subjective. Different executives, whether in the CFO or the COO or the CSO position, have different ways of evaluating risk and different sensibilities. But one thing is true, and that is that you can't ignore dynamic sort of evolving situations globally. And we need better ways of doing these evaluations. We can only do that if we know the supply chain and we know what's happening where.
Yeah, definitely. Tell me, Anja, is the Trustrace, the canvas, aimed at the retailer, at the actual brand?
It's aimed at both brands and retailers and regulators and stakeholders, because I think what we hear from all sides is that people want standardization, because until and unless we have that, we will continue what's happening now, which is that every single brand interprets the laws and regulations in their way. They then ask their suppliers for a certain type of information in a certain format, in a certain platform, in a certain frequency. And that is different for every brand, which means that suppliers, on the other hand, they have to manage a much, much higher data load, that if it were a standard set of data requirements at a standard timing, that they know what's being used for also. Because one thing is collecting information. We're calling it data, but a lot of it is information. It's documents, it's evidence, so you can prove compliance. It's not necessarily, data that's just easy to slice and dice and analyze because it's in different forms, right? And is not standardized across. So it's really about sharing a basic thinking of how you can do this in a structured way, how you can create a taxonomy that is scalable, that is not only, you'll be compliant with these laws and regulations, but to Brooke's point, you will have visibility. You will understand what your supply chain looks like. You will understand where the majority of your production goes. You will understand where your biggest opportunities for impact are. You will understand where your biggest risks are. So you can, again, you can't improve what you cannot measure, is what we usually say, because we started out as a grassroots organization to improve the adverse effects of fashion production that our founders saw in India. But it really is about, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, you can't improve it, you can't really do anything. So it's about creating this, instead of also today where it's a volume of data, you can almost call it data hoarding. Let's just take what we can get because it's not easily accessible, to go to quality. Ensure it's high quality so you can base your decisions on something of value. Ensure that you have the contextual understanding of how to interpret that data, so you don't make the wrong conclusions because you're just looking at, for instance, emissions, but not what's causing those emissions to happen, what affects the scope 3 in that factory over the course of the year. So it's really about having a common understanding of what is necessary or what is required, so you can start focusing on that, and you will have kind of time over to discuss the context. So it's not just, suppliers sharing data blindly, but actually saying, this is what we want to achieve. This is the data we need to do that. And this is kind of the contextual understanding we need to have that will come from suppliers, because they're the experts on their geography, their manufacturing, their systems. Like, they know how to improve it. But it needs to really be a collaboration. And without having that foundation, it becomes very hard to collaborate. So that's really what we're trying to achieve, and sharing it with the regulators too, because they know what they want to achieve, and they try to set standards, but they're also trying to figure out, but what does it actually mean? Like, is this too complex to execute or not?
But I guess every single stakeholder then within that supply chain needs to be aware of the information they need to provide.
Yeah.
And the compass can be, it can be used for that too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also, frankly, to push back on if you have too many requests, like, what should I prioritize? What is actually meaningful?
Yeah.
What is necessary? What is vital? And what is more, this would be nice to have? So you can really start prioritizing the most important things first.
Yeah. Brooke, maybe you could give a little insight in how smaller businesses might prioritize this. Where would they start? Where would you start?
Well, I'm so glad you asked me, because I've only recently met with a micro enterprise here in the UK. And I do meet with SMEs as well. And it's tricky for them because most of them operate a model where they source from tier 1.
Yeah.
And the tier 1 supplier provides everything for them. All of the sampling, all of the product development, they source the fabrics. And so really what we're talking about here is companies that are in the business of producing goods and retailing them versus companies that know how things are made.
Yes.
That's almost where the line is.
Yeah.
And that brings tremendous challenges. So I think the first thing for any micro enterprise or SME is to start to consider this as a tiered industry, and to start looking beyond tier 1 and mapping. Just as Anja said, the first thing is to understand who are your tier 1s, ideally who are your tier 2s, and how can you encourage them to tell you that information when it may not be in their best interests. And then, if you can go back to tier 3 and spinning, amazing, but it's less of an environmental issue at that stage. So I think it's mapping tier 1 and tier 2, and then working out what your hero products are and hero fabrics. Where is the highest volume that you're doing? What are your goals for improving that? What data do you need in order to do that? Because keep in mind that the corporate regulations will not be relevant directly to these organizations, but the product level ones may well be. The jury's out a little bit on that at the moment. As far as we're aware right now, any product that goes onto the market, regardless of organization size, will be in scope for DPP, for example, within the SDR. So we need to kind of really, I guess, take quite a pragmatic point of view and look at this from that standpoint. I think for the SMEs and the micro enterprises, it's about the products, as I said, and about
Yeah.
that side of the traceability. It's probably less so about the sort of wholesale auditing and due diligence on the social side and things like UFLPA and the sort of sourcing of quantities of materials from certain jurisdictions and that kind of thing. So it's a little bit of a split approach, I would say. But one thing I want to add to that is that micro enterprises and SMEs are horribly overlooked, generally speaking, and it's a bugbear I have as a journalist that I spend 90% of my time talking to the top 5% of brands and manufacturers globally. So what we have right now in our discourse around this is not any sort of degree of representation of the industry wholesale. And I really do want to address that. And that's one of the things that we talk about a lot, Anja, isn't it? Is how do we do the work in these playbooks, which are free resources, to help these businesses which cannot afford consultancy
Exactly.
and are really grappling with day-to-day challenges in running their businesses and keeping them going, and who need the sort of the top line, well evaluated answers. They do not have the resources and the time to be working this all out for themselves. So in our way, I think we are trying to address that and to put some sort of figure on it. And I dig a lot for figures. This is one of the things that I enjoy trying to do is evaluate all of this is, it was actually last year in the interview with Kapal for last year's Trustrace playbook where we started looking at this SME number, and a sort of an indicative figure that we arrived at was that whilst, maybe 5 or 10 brands in Europe account for half of what's on the market, many thousands equate for the other half.
Exactly.
Can't ignore them. They're an important part of so many aspects of what we do. And they're sometimes the first adopters of the technologies and the sort of the designs and the materials that need a look in before they get to scale, and solve the problems sort of industry wide.
Yeah.
I think there's also an element there of, because we want a fashion industry that's like that, right? Because what is likely to happen if the burden becomes too cumbersome and too just large to manage? All the suppliers we talk to, irrespective of size, they have at least 3 people working on just data collection. Same thing on the brand side. If it becomes too difficult, these brands will go out of business, and we have already seen some do that in the last couple of years, right?
Yeah.
We don't want that. You want the creativity. You want a thriving, diverse ecosystem.
Yeah.
But then we need to provide, the solution providers, the regulators, we need to provide the aid to make that possible. So you can really, again, people want to focus on what they do best. Nobody got into fashion because they are passionate about compliance,
Data.
right?
Yeah.
It's like, how can we then make that possible to focus on that and be able to have the joy and pride in that and not be weighed down by all the requirements that come, and the anxiety, frankly, that also comes from trying to be compliant with something you don't even understand, and knowing there's a big dark cloud hanging over you, but not when the rain and the thunder is going to hit. So that's really what we just want to make it easier to do the right thing, to do what you do best and do the right thing.
Okay.
Yeah. I also think there's just an element here of fashion sort of being dismissed as something that's a frivolous industry. For too long, it's been thought of as sort of very, very ephemeral and very sort of creativity driven. It's also a tremendous engine for social, progression and for equality, actually, and the sort of development, not just of nations, but of kind of people without a lot of skilled labor or education being able to transcend those limitations. So it deserves a little bit more rigor, I think, and it deserves our efforts to try and make all of this more accessible and easier to do. I think that's actually a lot of the work we need to do, is to just make this easy and actually almost like, I was going to say enjoyable. I love numbers. Maybe not enjoyable for everyone, but there's definitely a lot to get excited about once you see the potential of it.
But this is the next chapter, isn't it? And it has to be faced at whatever level, really. Most definitely. I think really kind of, I suppose, for a lot of people that are listening, the elephant in the room is 16 of the 16 new regulations. Which are the ones to focus on? Which, if we've only got about 5 minutes left here. So what I'd like to do is just really, Anja, just spotlight what they are. And then I'd like to conclude talking about the huge opportunity that there is here for businesses that invest in this now, whatever level they need to invest at, but that they start to make moves into providing this data.
Yes, I think to the point with compliance, you need to be compliant with all of them, right? But not all of them are in force yet. So the DPP, which will be the most granular one, you got a couple of years still. The delegated acts don't come out until next year. But so what we recommend is more like, ultimately you will need to know, not just as a brand, as a supplier, the whole ecosystem will need to be digital, and the information will be readily available, because each pod will have the responsibility and they will share it, like in a banking system, right? Yeah. We have a lot of local currencies that was not connected a while ago, but now it is. So we will get to there. But in the meantime, I think it's a question of, having that pathway and understanding where you need to go first. So if we're looking at the regulatory landscape, the first thing you need to do is you need to map your supply chain. You need to know where things are coming from so you can do your due diligence. That's on a network level, right? That's just ensuring that you're sourcing in a responsible way and there's no social and environmental, risks there. And then when you have that, then you can start saying, okay, but doing traceability, okay, where do my products come from? Where do I have, certain material risks that come from these regions? So you start building your understanding and your knowledge base, and you just keep going. Then you go to individual product traceability, real-time traceability, and then you can start gathering all this data, which you will need to do for DPPs on a unique product level, where you then also add the circularity aspects of repairs and everything. So it's really about building the muscle and building the capacity and the infrastructure to do that. So start with mapping, then do traceability, and then you can start going more and more real time with your different parts of your portfolio.
Start somewhere. Get going.
Start somewhere. Yeah,
start somewhere. Brooke, to conclude, could you just kind of explain why this is such a fantastic, positive opportunity for anybody, any stakeholder within the supply chain?
Well, because once you start doing this work and you understand your supply chain better, you can change the way that you're working. You can address problems. You can improve your product. You can, most importantly, create resilience in your business. You can make better decisions that safeguard you. Yeah. So I don't see another way, quite frankly. And I think, adding on to what Anja said as well, if I were putting my brand hat back on, I went back a few years, I would actually go to the Trustrace website and I would download the playbook, the most recent one, but also the one before, which was the DPP one. And also there's just general traceability ones that talk about the mapping that Anja was describing. They're all free resources you can download. And within the latest one, for example, I can just say there's a timeline of all the regulations, of when they come in. Mm-hmm. There's a summary of who's in scope. Yep. And then there's also the processes that Adidas, Primark, and Hugo Boss went through, and an explanation of how they did it. And then there's also the spreadsheet to download, which tells you all the buckets of regulations and the different areas they cover across the 16 and the data that you need for each.
Oh, that's great.
So I think you've kind of right there, you've probably got a couple of months' work ahead of you if you're a micro or SME, but you're well on the way.
Yeah, prepare.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Have your roadmap. You just need to follow it.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, ladies, thank you so much. Brooke, thank you so much for getting here. That's wonderful. And Anja, thank you so much. Have a great summer. I think we have to reconvene here in the autumn. Most definitely. There is so much information and so much knowledge to share. Anja, I know you have a meeting to get to, so let's end here. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Let's consider this the first chapter and we'll reconvene.
Sounds good.
Thank you, ladies.
Bye.
Thank you very much.